Welcome to the debate. In structural engineering, there's this concept called ultimate tensile strength.
Right.
You apply tension to a cable, just stretching it tighter and tighter. And for a long time, the cable looks perfectly fine from the outside. I mean, it holds the weight. But beneath the surface, on a molecular level, the material is warping.
Yeah, it's degrading. And the really dangerous part of that engineering metric is that you rarely know exactly where that breaking point is, until you've already crossed it. The failure happens all at once.
Precisely. And looking at the recent intelligence reports regarding the unfolding 2026 U.S.-Iran war, we are watching the ultimate tensile strength of a nation's foreign policy being tested in real time.
We really are.
We're looking at India's highly controversial decision to vote against a United Nations Human Rights Council resolution. Now, this was a measure that explicitly condemned Iran's crackdown on domestic protests, and it sought to extend an international fact-finding mission.
Right.
So, the core question we are unpacking today is this. Should India prioritize long-term neutrality and its, frankly, enormous economic interests over taking a moral stand on the global stage?
It is a profound question. Because we have a global energy crisis, we have the Strait of Hormuz effectively bottlenecked, the geopolitical landscape is shifting violently under our feet, and, well, India is right in the crosshairs.
Yeah. And based on the data we're seeing, my perspective is that India's economic survival, its energy security, and the physical safety of its massive diaspora, that all make strict strategic neutrality an absolute non-negotiable necessity. Taking an ideological position at the UN it's a luxury New Delhi simply cannot afford right now.
And looking at those exact same geopolitical realities, I view this entirely differently. By explicitly voting against a human rights resolution at the UN, India damages its international credibility without actually shielding itself from the economic fallout of Iran's actions. I mean, it is a sacrifice of democratic reputation for an illusion of security.
Well, to understand why India voted the way it did, we really have to look at the structural mechanics of its economy. India's vote at the UNHRC, choosing to vote no rather than just abstain, it's driven by stark math.
The demographic math, yeah.
Exactly. There are 9.1 million Indian citizens currently working in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC countries. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar.
Wow, 9.1 million.
Right. And those citizens send home $50 billion in annual remittances. For context, that money is the lifeblood of rural Indian economies, and it is mathematically vital for balancing India's national trade deficit.
Sure.
On top of that, India relies on the Strait of Hormuz for 80% of its natural gas and 60% of its crude oil.
Well, those are undeniable vulnerabilities, absolutely. But I fundamentally reject the premise that India's UN vote constitutes neutrality. I mean, if a nation wants to signal non-interference, the established diplomatic mechanism is an abstention.
Which is what India has historically done on these types of resolutions.
Right. In 2022 and 2024, when similar resolutions came up regarding Iran, India abstained. That is the classic non-aligned movement playbook. But this time, the measure passed 25-7. By casting a definitive no vote, India chose to join a bloc with China, Pakistan, and Iraq.
Yeah, they did.
They took a definitive stance shielding a regime that, according to the UN Special Rapporteur, has reported over 3,100 deaths in these protests. And my central argument here is that this strategy fails on its own pragmatic terms. Voting for Iran at the UN hasn't protected India's economy.
Well,
Iran is currently bottlenecking the Strait of Hormuz, turning global trade into a weapon, and they recently attacked a Thai ship headed specifically to an Indian port.
okay, let me walk you through the mechanics of why New Delhi views this differently. You're looking at a single ship attack, but Indian policymakers are looking at a concept we could call hostage economics.
Hostage economics.
Right. Let's look at the logistics of those 9.1 million people. In 1990, during the Gulf War, India executed the largest civilian evacuation in history. Air India flew nearly 500 flights over 2 months to pull 200,000 citizens out of Kuwait.
It was an incredible logistical feat.
It really was. Now multiply that feat by 45. 9.1 million people cannot be airlifted. It is a mathematical impossibility.
Yeah, the scale is just too massive.
Exactly. So if the Gulf region collapses into total chaos, or if Iran decides to deliberately target nations that have aligned against it globally, those 9.1 million Indians are effectively trapped. India has to maintain working channels with all regional actors, especially the regime in Tehran, to ensure the sheer physical safety of its citizens.
I hear you, but
A symbolic human rights vote at the UN is just not worth inviting Iranian hostility toward Indian workers living across the Persian Gulf.
I have to admit, I am completely lost on the strategic math here. If you're listening to this, you might be wondering, how does an accommodating UN vote change Iran's naval strategy?
Well, it's about not making yourself a target.
But Iran's broader strategy right now involves disrupting $455 million a day in trade through the Strait of Hormuz. That is what is causing the energy crisis in India. That is what's forcing the Indian government to invoke emergency powers over cooking gas, because LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, is overwhelmingly sourced from the Middle East.
True.
Iran isn't threatening to hurt India's economy if India votes against them. They are already hurting India's economy. Voting to protect Iran at the UN to secure your shipping lanes while they are actively mining those lanes is like paying your insurance premium to the guy who is currently setting fire to your car.
I understand why it looks that way, but let's break down how that choke point actually works. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the actual shipping lanes, they're just 2 miles wide in each direction.
It's a tiny needle of thread.
Right, and Iran operates using asymmetric naval tactics. Fast attack craft, cheap sea mines, drones. They don't need big destroyers to shut it down. Right now, their disruptions are, a generalized, desperate response to the U.S. naval blockade. They are fighting for regime survival.
Sure, they're cornered.
Exactly. In that hyper-volatile state, if India publicly kicks Iran while it's down at the UN, Tehran could easily shift from causing generalized disruption to targeted hostility. They could purposefully seize Indian vessels or activate proxy networks to target Indian expatriates.
But wait, if protecting citizens and minimizing exposure is the primary goal, why is India pouring $120 million into an Iranian port right now? That seems like it's making the entanglement worse, not better.
You're talking about the Chabahar port.
Exactly. I'm talking about long-term neutrality, yet India is heavily invested in Iranian state infrastructure. How does that fit the narrative of just trying to survive the crossfire?
Well, that is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and it really comes down to geography and leverage. Chabahar is a strategically vital port in southeastern Iran, right on the Gulf of Oman. For India, this isn't just a commercial dock.
Right.
It is the sole gateway to Afghanistan and Central Asia that completely bypasses Pakistan. Because Pakistan denies India overland transit rights, India physically cannot project economic power into Central Asia without going by sea to Iran first.
It's a geographic workaround.
Precisely. Chabahar is decades of strategic infrastructure planning explicitly designed to counter China's massive presence in Pakistan's Gwadar port, which is just down the coastline.
I get that, but the timing of this is incredibly precarious. The U.S. Treasury Department issues sanctions waivers that allow India to operate that port without getting hit by secondary U.S. sanctions, and that waiver expires in April 2026.
Yes, which is right now.
Right. The mechanism here is incredibly delicate. India is weighing a temporary divestment, meaning transferring their operational stake to an Iranian entity just to keep the project alive on paper without triggering U.S. sanctions. Now, trace the logic. If India had voted to condemn Iran at the UN, Tehran would immediately revoke India's access to Chabahar entirely.
Without a doubt.
That strategic gateway vanishes overnight. Condemning Iran guarantees the loss of a geopolitical asset that India needs to balance against China.
Wait, you're making my point for me.
I see the geographic logic, but look at the cost of clinging to that asset. We have to examine what Washington is doing. Is holding on to one heavily sanctioned port in a volatile country worth alienating the Western alliance?
It's not about alienating the West.
But the U.S. is aggressively pursuing a maximum pressure campaign. We're seeing the administration impose what they call Liberation Day tariffs. For anyone unfamiliar, this is a severe economic penalty, a a 25% tariff plus an additional 25% surcharge specifically targeting Indian exports. The U.S. is applying this because of India's continued purchase of Russian oil and their ongoing financial engagement with regimes like Iran.
Look, the economic headwinds from Washington are definitely severe, but Indian foreign policy isn't dictated by U.S. tariff schedules.
It isn't, but perhaps it should account for the broader reality. The U.S. and Israel are waging a campaign to effectively decapitate the Iranian regime's leadership and dismantle its military infrastructure. Tying India's strategic future to a $120 million port in Iran looks increasingly like betting on a failing state.
I wouldn't call it a failing state just yet.
But by trying to save Chabahar, India is antagonizing a U.S. administration that holds the keys to vastly more significant trade agreements, defense technology, and foreign direct investment. It feels like a severe miscalculation of strategic priorities.
I have to push back on that because it assumes India's baseline should be alignment with Washington. India maintains a doctrine of strategic autonomy. From New Delhi's perspective, the UN Human Rights Council is highly politicized. India has a long-standing, principled opposition to country-specific resolutions and the practice of naming and shaming at the UN. Their diplomatic corps believes that weaponizing UN mandates rarely improves human rights outcomes on the ground. It just isolates nations and makes back-channel diplomacy impossible.
But the global context has shifted, and the domestic audience inside India clearly sees the contradiction in that doctrine. Even domestic opposition leaders are calling this out. Sonia Gandhi recently published a widely circulated column stating, "Silence in this instance is not neutral."
That's domestic politics, though.
But it speaks to a broader truth. When the targeted killing of foreign leaders and the deaths of thousands of civilian protesters draw no clear defense of international law from New Delhi, it raises serious doubts about India's credibility. If you want to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, you have to take a stand on global security.
But India did take action, just not on a public microphone. External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar has been working the phones relentlessly. He has engaged in direct bilateral diplomacy with Iran's foreign minister, Israel's foreign minister, and leaders across Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE.
That's true. He has been very active behind the scenes.
Right, and he explicitly called for restraint, dialogue, and prioritizing civilian safety. India believed in utilizing quiet, direct diplomacy rather than grandstanding with a UN vote that changes nothing on the ground.
Quiet diplomacy has its place, but a UN vote is fundamentally a public declaration of your national values. And the diplomatic damage of this vote isn't just felt in Washington or London, it's happening in India's own backyard. Let's look at India's Neighborhood First policy.
You mean their strategy to build benevolent partnerships across South Asia?
Exactly. India wants to be seen as the democratic anchor of the global South, a reliable alternative to Chinese hegemony. But that policy is currently fraying. We've seen recent Gen Z-led protests topple the government in Nepal and violent anti-India backlash in Bangladesh.
Which are complicated internal matters.
Yes, but when democratic norms are under immense stress in South Asia, and the youth in these countries are fighting autocracy, how does it look when India stands shoulder to shoulder with China and Iran at the UN? It ruins their brand. It weakens India's claim to being a rising democratic superpower.
I think that underestimates how the Global South actually views these conflicts. The nations of the Global South understand the brutal pragmatism required to survive in a multipolar world. They understand that when a nation of 1.4 billion people has to import the vast majority of its energy through a war zone, it does not have the luxury of perfectly clean hands.
So survival justifies the vote?
You secure your supply lines first. Morality comes after the cooking gas is secured and the factories have power.
But again, let's look at the mechanism of those supply lines. The strategy of diplomatic appeasement at the UN is failing to yield physical security in the water. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to normal commercial traffic.
Well, mostly closed.
Shipping insurers have outright canceled war risk coverage for vessels entering the area. Even the International Energy Agency's emergency release of 400 million barrels of crude oil failed to stabilize global prices. India is suffering the economic shockwaves of this war regardless of how politely they vote at the UNHRC. If your pragmatism doesn't actually appease the aggressor or secure the oil, all you have done is trade away your principles for nothing.
I disagree with the framing that it's for nothing. It's about preventing escalation from a bad situation to a catastrophic one. Look at the alternatives. If India joins the Western Bloc in condemning Iran, they lose Chabahar, they risk their diaspora, and they force themselves into total reliance on the United States for energy security.
Right, which they've historically avoided.
Exactly. India remembers when the U.S. placed sanctions on them in the past. Maintaining a working relationship with Tehran is a hedge. It keeps India from being entirely dependent on Washington's unpredictable foreign policy.
I understand the fear of over-reliance on the U.S., but we also have to look at how the Gulf states themselves are reacting to this crisis. Countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are right in the line of fire. They host those millions of Indian workers we've been discussing, and yet even they are heavily recalibrating their stances.
In what way?
Well, the UAE has shut down its Tehran embassy and summoned their envoy amid Iranian missile attacks. If the very Arab states that host the Indian diaspora are taking a firmer line against Iranian aggression, why is India isolating itself by voting to protect Iran at the UN?
Because the Gulf states operate under a very different security paradigm. The UAE and Saudi Arabia rely on the U.S. security umbrella. They have advanced American missile defense systems like THAAD, which acts as a high-altitude shield against incoming ballistic missiles.
That's true.
They have Patriot batteries and Aegis destroyers parked off their coasts. India does not have that specific regional umbrella in the Gulf. India has to protect its interests using diplomatic leverage, not American interceptor missiles. By keeping a line open to Tehran and voting based on process over politics at the UN, India retains its own autonomous leverage in the region.
Is it autonomy, or is it paralysis disguised in strategy? The argument for maintaining a diplomatic channel to Tehran makes perfect sense in peacetime, but we are in the middle of a hot war. The UN rapporteur confirmed authorities reported over 3,000 deaths in these protests.
It's tragic, absolutely.
By voting against the fact-finding mission, India isn't just keeping a diplomatic channel open. It is using its geopolitical weight to shield a regime from international accountability. And when you look at the broader picture, the U.S.-Israel coalition dismantling Iran's offensive capabilities, the collapsing Iranian domestic economy, the real potential for regime collapse, India might be tying its diplomatic anchor to a sinking ship.
Well, as we step back to summarize our positions today, this debate really highlights the sheer weight of governing a country of 1.4 billion people. From my perspective, the burden of leadership requires pragmatism to triumph over symbolism. When you are balancing $50 billion in remittances that keep your rural economy afloat, the physical safety of 9.1 million citizens trapped in a war zone, and a reliance on a 21-mile-wide choke point that could literally shut down your domestic power grid, you cannot govern based on idealized morality. A policy of non-interference and quiet back-channel diplomacy, even when it results in a highly controversial vote at the UN, is the only responsible path for a nation with India's unforgiving exposure in the Middle East.
And my conclusion rests on the tangible outcomes of that policy. If India's goal was true non-interference, the established diplomatic mechanism is an abstention. By taking the active step of voting no alongside nations like China and Pakistan, India compromised its moral standing. And crucially, it did so without actually securing the Strait of Hormuz or stopping Iran from bleeding the global economy.
Right.
In international relations, your long-term reputation as a democratic leader is a currency. I believe India spent that currency poorly, sacrificing its credibility in the global south for an illusion of economic safety that the war is dismantling anyway.
What we absolutely converge on, however, is the terrifying scale of the dilemma facing New Delhi. There are simply no easy off-ramps here. The scale of India's exposure in the Persian Gulf leaves policymakers with virtually zero margin for error.
None.
A single miscalculation, whether at the UN or in the Strait of Oman, could trigger an economic and humanitarian catastrophe.
I completely agree. Navigating the crossfire of a U.S.-Iran war while holding together a developing domestic economy is, well, it's a diplomatic tightrope walk of the highest order.
It brings us right back to that engineering metric we started with. The ultimate tensile strength. We are watching a geopolitical structure being loaded with the immense weight of energy crises, sanctions, and human lives, stretching the cables of international diplomacy to their absolute limits. The question that remains for all of us as we continue to analyze the realities of this 2026 landscape is just how much tension that bridge can take before something fundamentally breaks.